This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to the Enragé. I'm your host, Joel Williamson, and today we'll be speaking with Nathan Goodman about an article they wrote in May of 2021 titled Abolition, an Economist's Perspective. This fall, Nathan will become a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Economics at New York University, where he will be affiliated with the program on the foundations of the market economy. He earned his PhD in economics at George Mason University, where he was a PhD fellow with the Markakis Center and a graduate fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Studies in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Nathan's research broadly focuses on political economy, applied microeconomics, market process economics, new institutional economics, and defense economics. He analyzes how alternative institutional arrangements shape the provision of security. Nathan is also the former Lysander Spooner Research Scholar in Abolitionist Studies at C4SS. Nathan Goodman, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
For sure. So for anyone who hasn't read your article, could you give a brief rundown of what it's all about and why you decided to write it?
Yeah, so Abolition, an Economist's Perspective is one of three introductions for an upcoming C4SS anthology called Total Abolition, Police, Prisons, Borders, Empire. And so the book is a collection of a bunch of essays, most of them, but not all of them, previously published at C4SS, about essentially what the title says, abolishing police, prisons, borders, and empire. And so my piece serves in part as an introduction to the volume to sort of get readers who are just starting to read it into, hey, why might I want to consider and take seriously the notion of abolishing these types of institutions of coercive social control? But the particular perspective I'm writing it from is that professionally, I'm an economist. I just finished my PhD in economics. And I am also a prison abolitionist, a police abolitionist, an anarchist, someone who favors abolishing borders and immigration restrictions, someone who favors abolishing state-directed military forces and empire. And I was trying to work out, what is my role within this abolitionist movement as an economist? How does my analytical perspective as an economist inform my abolitionism and vice versa? And so, in some sense, this essay is really me situating myself now, because so much of what I have in terms of essays by me that are in the volume is stuff from before I started graduate school. So economics informs it because that's long been a part of my analytical framework for looking at these things. But the piece is sort of going through what is it about the way I understand economics that informs my abolitionism. So that's what I was thinking through as I was writing it, and that's sort of the set of themes that I was trying to work out there.
Yeah, and at the beginning of the article, you point out that abolitionists and economists tend to view one another more as enemies than allies. Why is this the case, and why should these groups reconsider their relation to one another?
Yeah, so to be fair, I'm not actually sure if economists in general would view abolitionists as enemies, simply because many economists probably haven't given abolition much thought. It's a radical position, and radical positions don't always get much play in the mainstream. And the average economist is a moderate Democrat, maybe a somewhat more left-wing Democrat now than the average economist would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. And then the groups of economists that I run with tend to be more free market libertarians, though I also work with, of course, more regular economists who are typical Democrats. But Radical leftist positions tend to be underrepresented in economics. There are some radical leftists in economics. They tend to be affiliated with groups like the Union of Radical Political Economics. There are some departments that have a fair number of left-wing heterodox economists, like the University of Utah's economics department and the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the New School. But even there, the primary perspectives are either Marxist or post-Keynesian. And the people who tend to be drawn into economics tend to be, from even those perspectives, tend to be focused on more standard class analysis stuff and less on anarchist stuff. And then when you get into the mainstream of economics, the neoclassical mainstream, we get a potential tension with abolitionism on the grounds that economics is all about trade-offs. And it's all about choices at the margin, at least within neoclassical economics. Some of the heterodox economists might disagree with this, but within the mainstream of economics and among neoclassical economists, we think a lot about choices at the margin. So that means your choice of, am I going to have one more glass of water? Am I going to spend another 30 minutes studying? Am I going to agree to do this podcast interview? As opposed to, am I going to drink water at all? Am I ever going to do podcast interviews? Am I ever going to drink coffee? These sorts of things. You're making choices at the margin. And when you're doing that, there will often be diminishing marginal benefit to additional things. So you might be more willing to pay for your first cup of coffee than your 15th. And that will also be true for reducing the quantity of bad things in the world, right? And so you might at first be willing to pay a great deal or willing to sacrifice a fair amount in order to reduce pollution if you're living in a smog-filled city. But once you've reduced pollution to a relatively tolerable amount, most people aren't going to be willing to make the trade-off of abolishing all industrial civilization in order to reduce pollution to zero. Now, this is an anarchist program, and there are, of course, anti-civ anarchists, so we're more likely than the average podcast to have listeners who would make that trade-off. But most people aren't willing to make that trade-off, and most economists would not be willing to make that trade-off. And that doesn't just apply to pollution, it applies to violent crime, it applies to any bad thing in the world. And so we'll often say, the optimal amount of pollution is not zero, the optimal amount of murder is not zero, the optimal amount of assault is not zero. And abolition is a very total position, right? That's in the title of the book, Total Abolition. And I think James Tuttle is writing a preface for the book that's called It's Not Abolished Until There's Nothing Left, right? And so that might seem at odds with this marginalist perspective, right? An economist who's looking at this might say, yeah, incarceration's bad, war's bad, borders are bad. Let's make choices at the margin that reduce the amount of those things, rather than saying, let's abolish them wholesale, let's fight against them until there is nothing left. They might say there's diminishing marginal benefits to doing that. After we've reduce the scale of these things in society and the scale of their impact in society by a certain amount, the costs of reducing them further will start to be greater than the benefits in terms of, say, losses in terms of the crime we have to tolerate, or the social disorder we might have to endure, or the possibility that we would have to invest too many resources in doing that. One way in which I resolved that tension early on in the piece is saying, well, abolitionist thought doesn't require us to take on all imaginable costs to rid ourselves of every last vestige of these forms of coercion and control, because prisons, police, borders, and empire are not just defined as the collection of criminal acts or violent activities that make up these things. It's also the social legitimization of these things. So when people think about murder or assault, even if they don't invest all resources to reduce those to zero, they recognize these as criminal activities. They don't say, the reason economists say the optimal amount of these isn't zero is not because they say, oh, well, it's good that we have those things per se as a policy tool. Instead, it's because they're saying, well, we should do what we can to reduce them, but at some point it's not going to be worth investing more resources to reducing them instead of to providing healthcare to people or producing food or, heck, producing entertainment, right? And so that same thing can be true about prisons, but it's important that we recognize that prisons, police, borders, and empire are not legitimate policy tools. They are, in fact, forms of criminal violence, forms of oppression, forms of destructive social control that we should not see as within our legitimate toolkit, and that we should be fighting to reduce and route around and striving to delegitimize. And so we can take an abolitionist attitude towards these things, even while we might at some point in the future wind up economizing on our abolitionist efforts in order to advance other liberatory goals.
You note how, with exceptions from racists like Thomas Carlyle, there's a historical precedent for common cause between abolitionists and political economists. You mentioned the example of how, in the context of chattel slavery, there was a synthesis and insights that helped them realize that slavery was not just morally repugnant, but also stifling human potential that would be unleashed if people were free to use their talents as they saw fit. What does the modern version of this look like in the context of prison abolition?
So that's a very good way of looking at it. And part of the role that Thomas Carlyle plays in that story is that the reason he dubbed economics the dismal science was precisely because he disliked that economists were aligned with abolitionists and anti-slavery reformers. And he thought this was a very bad thing. So people sometimes falsely assert that the reason economics is called the dismal science is because of Thomas Malthus's predictions that population growth would result in us running out of food. But in fact, it was that Thomas Carlyle disliked some of the anti-racist tendencies of economists at the time. Now, I think that the way in which this ties into the modern struggle for prison abolition is at least twofold. So the first is that part of why economists tended to be opposed to slavery is that economists applied a sort of egalitarian analytical framework. The same premises that we use to study one group of people, we're going to use to study another group of people. So economists were not saying, black people are fundamentally different from white people, right? Which was what the racialist proponents of slavery were saying. Instead, they were saying people, regardless of race, are individuals who respond to incentives, who can act creatively, who have their own knowledge, who would like to have their own plans that they exercise. And one result of this is that there are perverse incentives associated with controlling other people, and that individuals who are free to choose what they want to do and keep the products of their labor will seek out ways to use their talents in a manner that will be beneficial to others around them. Whereas when they're directly enslaved by people, the slaveholder will only wind up using them for those things where the slaveholder can directly monitor and control them. And the slave will have no incentive to tell the slaveholder, hey, I could make you more money doing this other thing, right? That's not a viable option. And so in addition to it being a horrible, horrible, immoral system of repression and dehumanization, it also stifles the human potential of the slaves and distorts the incentives of the slaveholders in a collection of ways that are destructive to total human prosperity. And the same thing is going to be true for the operation of the prison system, right? It's true that many people who are incarcerated have engaged in some form of zero-sum interaction, some form of interaction where they hurt or exploit another person. Though, of course, many have not. Many are nonviolent offenses as well. But regardless of that, they also have the capacity to do things that help others, to use their minds and their skills creatively in ways that enrich the rest of humanity. And their ability to do that both while they're incarcerated and after the fact is constrained by the fact that they're locked in a cage, and then later constrained by the fact that there are occupational licensing laws that prohibit former prisoners from doing a wide range of jobs. And so they're locked out of entire professions where their talents could be used in ways that would enrich them and enrich other people. And that, of course, increases their own risk of recidivism, because it means that some of the only options that are on the table for them are returning to the types of criminal activities that they happen to, through their prison experience, have social networks for lucrative opportunities related to this. And they may have experience in it, right? So it increases risk of recidivism while also closing off opportunities for them to improve their own situation and improve the situations of others. Meanwhile, human effort gets funneled into maintaining and lobbying for the expansion of or maintenance of the prison industrial complex, right? People who are prison guards will often join prison guards unions, and those prison guards unions have incentives to lobby to keep the prison they work for open, to maintain harsher criminal penalties. Those who work for or operate contracting companies that provide various services to prisons have similar types of incentives. Companies that profit by managing the market for prison labor, essentially in some cases treating prisoners like slaves, right? They have their own set of perverse incentives to keep that system going. And so you have both the coercive restriction of the potential of the prisoners and the former prisoners, combined with the distortion of the incentives of those who currently profit from or see future opportunities to profit from the prison industrial complex, and therefore will divert their energies into this production of social control and predatory use of the state and away from the types of activities that might see them producing things that benefit people or society as a whole, right? So a company, for example, that provides cell phone services within prisons and will wind up investing a fair amount of their resources lobbying to maintain the monopoly privileges they have in prisons and to stop the Federal Communications Commission from restricting the prices they can charge prisoners, right? That energy devoted to lobbying is not energy that they might otherwise be devoting to improving telecommunications capabilities more generally, though some people within the company will probably have talents that could be used towards those ends.
Okay. You highlight that the knowledge problem and the power problem are examples of what economists can bring to the discussion of abolition. In regards to the knowledge problem, you point out how police, prisons, borders, and empire disrupt knowledge and social learning. Are these institutions that you point out in that list always and necessarily limited in this way? Or is it theoretically possible for them to work around these limitations?
So that's a good question. And I suppose the answer would vary depending on what we mean by that, in the sense that we could have instances of these institutions that are more or less destructive of knowledge, though they're always going to face knowledge limitations, epistemic limitations. So it's worth unpacking a little bit what I mean by this. So when we talk about the knowledge problem, we're talking in part, at least, about making decisions about the use of scarce resources in a changing world. So when people operate directly within a market setting, they have the ability to engage in exchanges with one another. And what that means is that when those exchanges take place, one thing that emerges from those exchanges is exchange ratios that we call prices. And those prices then communicate particular types of knowledge. So, for example, if a tin mine were to collapse somewhere halfway around the world, that would reduce the supply of tin, which would raise the price of tin. This would result first in an increase in the price of products made with tin, which would result in an incentive for consumers to economize on their use of that tin and seek out products made with substitutes. It would also result in entrepreneurs and businesses having an incentive to seek out substitutes for tin in their production processes. And by the way, the same would be true if for some reason a product derived from tin became more popular or became more necessary. That would also result in an increase in prices that would create that incentive for people to economize. So that signal and incentive provided by prices operates within market context. It can be, and in fact is, heavily distorted by states in the form of state crony capitalist markets that we actually live within, but it's there. By contrast, when the state is providing something, they do not face the same types of incentives to economize because they don't keep the profits or face the losses resulting from their activities, and because they don't have to engage in voluntary exchanges with people in order to accrue resources or in order to produce their product, right? It's not as though the prisons are producing a product for either people who have to find the protection allegedly provided by prisons worth it, or for inmates who have to find it worth it to live there, right? The prisons are not hotels. They are places where people are involuntarily confined. And so the involuntary aspects of this create a distortion in that it results in a situation where, whereas with markets, exchanges happen because both parties, at least prior to the exchange, believe they're mutually beneficial. And so their local knowledge of their own preferences and their own constraints gets incorporated in what sets of choices they make, and then shapes the overall collection of prices and profit and loss feedback that firms face. None of that's happening in these contexts that involve heavy degrees of coercion. Now, moreover, we see people's ability to engage in those types of collaborative processes directly disrupted and suppressed by these systems, right? So somebody might be on their way to engage in a voluntary transaction with another person, a voluntary exchange with another person, and the police might seize their car or their cash or any other piece of property of theirs through civil asset forfeiture. And so their ability to engage in and participate in the market process has been hampered by that violation of their property rights. And of course, someone who's incarcerated within a prison, they can't go engage in exchanges with whomever they would like outside the prison. And people are, in fact, often restricted in their ability to enter the prison to engage in exchanges with them, even if it would be in their interest to do so. Likewise, immigration restrictions prohibit people from crossing borders to places where people are willing to and able to pay them more than they would on the other side of the border, which both traps the prospective migrants in poverty and reduces the total amount of goods and services that are produced, right? This is a big part of why immigration restrictions make the world drastically poorer. The estimates that economists have derived through various models for the benefits from open borders to global production are enormous. And so this hampering of the market process hampers the discovery of and use of the distributed knowledge that is distributed around all sorts of people in the world, right? Now, how constrained they are in their use of knowledge is going to depend in part on the institutional features of these. So, for example, Eleanor Ostrom, in her research on police departments, found that smaller, more localized police departments tended to do more to satisfy local citizens than police departments that were consolidated across an entire metropolitan area. And part of the reason for that is that citizens were able to vote with their feet. So citizens were able to say, well, I really don't like the public services in my neighborhood, but if I move a little bit across town to a adjacent precinct, maybe I like the public services better. The other reason is that because these were smaller units, citizens could voice their concerns more easily. Often the people producing services would be people they would know or that they would see on a day-to-day basis, neighborhood beat cop as opposed to a cop who's driving around in a car, or a cop from outside of the neighborhood, right? And so those person-to-person interactions could allow communication of knowledge and could allow what Ostrom called co-production. And so more localized provision of these things could, in theory, result in fewer disjoints between local knowledge and whatever parts of these systems we could understand as legitimate services. So that would alleviate the knowledge problem to some extent, but it would still be there. Whenever you've got these non-priced, bureaucratically produced outputs, you can't engage in economic calculation, and so you need to engage in political choices that serve as a substitute for calculation. And so the knowledge problem is going to be present in all of these things, but how severe it's going to be is going to vary depending on the institutional features. And making the systems more polycentric, for example, or reducing the range of ways in which they can violate people's rights, those are some ways to reduce the knowledge-destroying tendencies of these things. So, for example, another thing that we can imagine that would be less knowledge destroying would be if we had something close to open borders, but we still had borders. The knowledge that was destroyed and the productive capabilities that are destroyed by immigration restrictions, well, those wouldn't be as big of a deal. Borders would cease to be a way of centrally planning the labor market and telling people, no, you can't move to this place where your labor is more valued. If they instead were just a way of monitoring who was crossing the border, there would still be problems of social control that are worth it for us to address as anarchists, but it wouldn't have these same features of being central planning of the labor market with all the knowledge and incentive problems that entails.
Mm-hmm. As a response to the pitfalls of political romance, some economists apply, quote, behavioral symmetry to both state and non-state actors. You actually go one step further, turning politically romantic assumptions on its head by introducing insights illuminated by the power problem. What is the power problem, and how is it relevant to the cause of abolition?
So the power problem basically refers to the idea that systems of centralized social control will generate both incentives and filtering mechanisms that result in people acting badly, that result in people abusing their power. And the first sort of step of analyzing the power problem, as you note, involves the application of behavioral symmetry. So this is a notion derived from public choice theory that basically says people are pretty much the same across state and non-state environments. And so that's going to mean that while they can have some other regarding desires, they also want to do pretty well for themselves and maybe their friends or their families. And so they're going to respond to incentives. And so we can apply the same economic concepts that we would use to analyze people's actions in markets, to analyze their actions in politics. And lo and behold, that's going to result in us seeing some situations where politics generates perverse incentives for people to do things like seek to increase the budgets of agencies they work for, or as voters to not invest much time in researching and learning about the candidates, or as private businesses to invest resources in lobbying government officials for monopoly privileges or subsidies or contracts with the military. But the way in which I take it a step further is I say behavioral symmetry is a nice analytical assumption for us to use just to see if people are basically the same across these settings, how will things work. But there may in fact be filtering mechanisms that result in some people sorting into acting within particular types of roles. So if you imagine two people who get a job as an overseer on a slave plantation, right? One of whom is very kind-hearted and one of whom is a sadistic, bigoted racist. Well, the kind-hearted person is going to find that line of work very troubling. He's going to be in position where he's supposed to, as a condition of his job, whip people, beat people, dehumanize people, and that is not going to be something that is pleasant for a kind-hearted person, but for a sadistic bigot, it's going to be something that's quite attractive. And so we're going to, over time, see a filtering process in which those who are not particularly inclined to use and abuse power to dominate their fellow human beings leave these jobs in which their role is social control. And those who are attracted to dominating their fellow human beings go into these types of jobs. And we see this within policing. So you will sometimes read news stories of situations in which a cop beats someone or maybe fabricates evidence or does something that violates the civil liberties of a suspect. And maybe their partner or someone who's there tries to blow the whistle on them. And they get ostracized by the whole department for, violating this sort of thin blue line code among police, right? And eventually they get driven out of the department. And so that's a filtering mechanism that means people who care more about respecting the civil liberties of people the police interact with are eventually filtered out of jobs within the police force. Whereas those who fit in with a culture of violence and impunity and control, they get to stay within the police departments in the long term. And they're also going to be attracted to jobs in the police force, right? Someone who's really mad at people who they perceive as criminal scumbags, or somebody who likes the idea of getting to beat people up or arrest people or otherwise dominate people. The ability to do those things, the ability to coerce other people is a perk of the job for that person. And so that, in some sense, is a perverse part of their compensation package that isn't a part of the compensation package for a decent person who joins the police force. And so gradually, this combination of culture and incentives is going to result in a filtering mechanism in which, as F.A. Hayek put it, the worst get on top, or in this case, the worst become cops. And so that type of filtering mechanism means that even if initially you set up these institutions with an idea that, well, the reason we have them is to protect individual rights. We have the police here to keep the peace. We're engaging in military imperialism because we need to be the good liberal hegemon that is going to preserve human rights around the globe, right? Eventually, those positions are going to be imbued with a form of discretionary power that's much more appealing to people who like to engage in social control and much more unpleasant to wield for those who don't like to engage in that sort of discretionary social control. And so illiberal and bad and authoritarian types of people are likely to get on top. And that filtering effect is going to mean that things will be even worse than the simple application of public choice with behavioral symmetry would suggest.
Okay. Another reason you've pointed out a couple times, but another reason to desire abolition is related to problems caused or related to political capitalism and industries that profit from the institutions we're seeking to abolish. The heart of the abolitionist knows this is unethical, But what might an economist have to say about the challenge of undoing or realigning the incentives that these companies face?
So that's a really good question. And it's tricky because right now their incentives are very closely tied with seeking the concentrated benefits that the state can provide. So by investing in lobbying, for example, they can wind up getting a bunch more in state expenditures than they expend in lobbying. And those concentrated benefits make it worth it for them to invest in seeking this type of state-granted privilege. Now, one thing that can alter their incentives is it becoming costly to their reputation for them to engage in this sort of activity. And so, for instance, it has in some cases become quite embarrassing to corporations that are involved in these types of activities when people protest at their offices, when investigative journalists write exposés on them, and in particular, when people start boycotting firms that otherwise do business with them. So, for example, the prison divestment campaign, which was a campaign that grew out of the immigrants' rights movement in the United States, did a fair amount of social pressure type campaigns against banks such as Wells Fargo that invested in private prison companies like the Corrections Corporation of America. And so the goal of this sort of campaign was to pressure Wells Fargo to divest from these corrections companies. Likewise, the Corrections Corporation of America, which I guess is now called CoreCivic, so I should make that clear so that listeners know where they could find this particular group of prison profiteers now. But Corrections Corporation of America, now CoreCivic, eventually dropped out of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which essentially is a group that brings together both for-profit and non-profit corporations to help draft model legislation that legislators from around the country go to conferences to learn about and eventually introduce. So many state legislators often don't have their own big teams of research staffs the way people in Congress do. And so going to ALEC conferences provides them with a convenient way to get legislation that they can introduce, and that makes it look like they're doing something. Well, Corrections Corporation of America, while they were part of ALEC, they helped write legislation like Arizona's SB 1070, which was an anti-immigrant bill. It was often framed when it was first passed in terms of a sort of show me your papers bill. It gave cops, local police in Arizona, increased power to try to investigate whether someone was an unauthorized immigrant and then potentially get them into the clutches of the immigration detention system, which included some detention centers operated by the Corrections Corporation of America. Now, Corrections Corporation of America eventually dropped out of participating in ALEC. They left. And that was in part due to the negative media attention that that sort of thing was drawing. And so public backlash can alter the incentives of companies, especially if that public backlash results in other firms being less willing to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges or investment with them. So that can be one thing that would alter their incentives in the short order. Obviously, there are other ways to impose costs on these sorts of firms beyond the scope of boycotts. So there are a range of things that people could do that would alter the incentives of people involved in these firms. And of course, the employees of these firms and the executives of these firms, they don't just value maximizing the value of their firms, right? They have lives and they have other aspirations. So another prison profiteering firm, the third largest in the country, at least last I checked, which was a while ago, is the Management and Training Corporation, which is based in Centerville, Utah. And when I was in Utah, the Utah Prison Divestment Campaign engaged in various direct protest activities against the board vice chair of the Management and Training Corporation, Jane Marquardt. And Jane Marquardt is an interesting person because while she operates a company that contracts heavily with the state to provide a mix of prisons, jails, detention centers, and job training facilities through the federal government's Job Corps program, she also sees herself as a progressive. So she was, around the time that we were protesting her, she ran for a position within the Utah Democratic Party. And some prison divestment campaign activists came to the sort of nominating convention where she was being nominated, and they would get up and start reading a speech about how she profits from locking marginalized people in cages. And she also is a lesbian, and I don't mean that as a way of like denigrating her for her sexuality. The point is that she is a LGBT civil rights activist of sorts, despite the fact that she also profits from operating prisons where horrible things have happened to members of the LGBT community. But she had received awards from local LGBTQ civil rights organizations like Equality Utah and the Human Rights Campaign. And so there was also pressure put on these nonprofits to cease offering or to rescind awards and accolades given to her for her either philanthropy or activism related to these things, because she was directly profiting from systems of social control and state control that involve brutal violence against more marginalized members of the LGBT community. And so because the individuals within these political capitalist enterprises don't just want to make direct profits, but also would like to be esteemed, would like to have positions of prominence within their communities, you can to some degree also target those and thereby reduce their incentives to engage in these forms of social control. So I don't know how effective any of that activism has been. And one thing I worry about with activism that focuses just on the private contractors is that it can wind up producing a view in which people overrate the amount to which private prisons are the main problem with the prison system. And private prisons are a relatively small portion of the prison system. And so I think a lot of people, when the Biden administration said the federal government, at least the Department of Justice, not unfortunately the Department of Homeland Security, which through ICE has a lot of contracts with private detention centers, but the Department of Justice said, we're not going to continue to operate private prisons or for-profit prisons. And I think many people may have seen that as a bigger victory than it was, because so much activism was focused on opposing those firms and not enough was focused on the overarching problems with incarceration, whether it's nominally private or nominally public. But there are things that you can do that make it costlier to be somebody who's profiting from these activities, is the basic thing that I'm trying to say here. And that type of activism will potentially alter the incentives. Now, whether it will alter it enough for people to change their behavior, that's an open question, and it depends on the values of the people involved. And it might be the case that what you would actually do is just result in a situation where other people would wind up in the same roles, people who don't care if people hate them, for example. But those are things that could potentially alter some of the underlying incentives to some extent, and that activists have attempted.
Cool. So when considering total liberation, some people assume that it will result in chaos, poverty, squalor, and civil war, as you point out in the piece. You mentioned her earlier, but how might Elinor Ostrom's work challenge this impulse?
Yeah, so her work is really important for understanding how we deal with collective action problems. And a lot of the things people are worried about when they hear about a notion of having an anarchic society are different forms of collective action problems. So how are we going to come together to produce public goods? How are we going to make sure that people don't opportunistically take advantage of each other by starting to rob from each other or steal from each other or abuse one another? Or, as was the case in her most famous book, Governing the Commons, how do we prevent the over-harvesting or overuse of common pool resources? So things like fisheries or forests or grazing or common pastures and grazing land. And for a long time, the view with regards to these sorts of collective action problems was that when you look at a common pool resource, the resource users are going to be trapped in remorseless tragedies, as Ostrom put it. And so they are going to be in a situation where, yeah, they might want to conserve, but if they conserve, if they say don't put as many sheep out on the grazing land to chomp on that grass and reduce the amount of grass, and they try to conserve, well, the other sheep herders will just put more on there, and the grazing land will still eventually be overgrazed, and they're going to just lose out. They're going to be a sucker. And so to avoid being a sucker, everyone's going to just race to get as much as they can in the short term. And the view among social scientists, for the most part, prior to Ostrom's work, was, all right, there are two ways we can deal with this. One, stop making it a commons. Privatize it. And so the idea there with grazing land will be, we'll put up fences and parcel it out into smaller grazing lands that are privately owned by different sheep herders. Okay, that means that the sheep herders who have their own private parcel do in fact have incentives to conserve that grazing land because they reap the full expected benefits of that grazing land in the future. They reap the future stream of payments from that grazing land. Great. Problem, though, when you divide it up, one thing that might happen is it might be the case that they're more vulnerable to adverse weather patterns. So, for example, maybe it's the case that if you have a big open common field, some areas of grass might be patchy some seasons and others might be lush. And you can move your sheep around and you can all get some of that. Whereas if you have your private patch of land, maybe one year you're going to have like no grass for your sheep and other times you're going to have a lot more. And maybe your sheep get a lot less exercise and maybe that matters. I don't know. But there's a range of ways in which a commons might wind up being more useful there. And so the other action besides privatizing that social scientists at the time saw as a potentially suitable response is government. We're going to have external government regulators come in and we're going to say, we're going to monitor you. And if you overgraze, well, we're going to make you pay a fine or we're going to lock you up in prison or we're going to shoot you, right? Usually not that extreme of a response, but it's going to be some exogenous, externally imposed regulation. So maybe the EPA is going to do it or the cops are going to do it or something like that, right? Now, what Ostrom did that many of the social scientists who had studied this hadn't done was she looked very widely at the empirical literature. She looked at studies by anthropologists. She looked at studies by people in various environmental studies disciplines. She looked at studies by sociologists and historians. She went with teams of researchers to people who were using common pool resources all over the world. And she talked with people about what they were doing. And she saw, oh, there are various long-lasting, long-sustained common pool resources that didn't follow either of these paths. They didn't just quickly devolve into a tragedy of the commons. They weren't parceled out and privatized, and they didn't have an external government coming in and imposing rules. Instead, the resource users themselves talked with each other, crafted rules, and yes, they did impose sanctions on one another when people violated those rules, but they tended to be graduated sanctions. So things like a situation where the first time you overgraze, people are like, hey, stop that. We don't do that here. And then, second offense, they say, hey, stop that. We don't do that here. And, third offense, maybe they start doing some genuinely mean stuff to you, right? But it's more of a graduated thing. There are arenas for collective decision-making. So people who are the direct resource users have input on the rules. There's arenas for conflict resolution and dispute resolution. So it's not just whoever gets accused automatically faces wrath and sanctions, right? We see rules being crafted from the bottom up. And so it's governance, but not necessarily provided by an external or monopolistic government. And that means when it comes to sort of our knowledge problem issues, local knowledge from the resource users regarding the social and ecological conditions and the norms and values of the resource users themselves gets incorporated into this process. And so this is one set of examples that show us that under at least some conditions, self-governance is possible without an external state apparatus coming in to impose order. And that's just one part of a broader literature that shows that self-governance works better than a lot of people think. And there are a range of contributions within this literature. So some people might say, okay, yeah, Ostrom found that, but those are for relatively small local communities. And they're often relatively homogenous communities. They're often communities that involve people who are all from the same local area. How are you going to deal with situations where you have people from multiple cultures or situations where you have international trade? Well, there we have, for example, Peter Leeson's research that finds that in pre-colonial Africa, people from disparate cultural groups who came together to trade would often engage in activities where they would adopt costly behaviors or signals in order to show that they wanted to interact with a group that was not their own over the long term. So they might invest in learning the language, or they might invest in conforming with some costly religious practices of the other group. And that served as a signal that, hey, this person's in it for the long haul. If they just wanted to get in, make a trade, rip me off and get out, it wouldn't be worth it for them to do this. It's only going to become worth it if they engage in repeated exchange with me. And so that provided a signal that allowed for trust for people to engage in repeated interaction with one another. And similar sorts of self-governing arrangements in situations of international trade arose in Europe with the Lex Mercatoria, which was a body of customary international merchant law, which economist Bruce Benson has written about extensively in books like The Enterprise of Law. He has another book that he's been working on that addresses some of the objections to that book and goes into more detail on the history of the Lex Mercatoria. So there's all these examples of people engaging in various forms of self-governance to address real problems of collective action and interaction and predation and opportunism and bad behavior. And that doesn't mean these mechanisms will always work. There are instances where they break down. But of course, there are instances where policing and prisons and borders and militarism break down as solutions to the problems they're purported to solve. And so perfection isn't on the table, but it may well be the case that we can, from the bottom up, craft ways of dealing with the types of problems that these systems of social control tell us they're the only way to solve. And those forms of grassroots self-governance can provide us with an alternative to top-down social control.
Right. So these spontaneous ways of cooperating with one another, they're obviously possible. But how do you respond to the concern that after abolition, the empty space left by the state would create a power vacuum that violently motivated groups could fill and exploit?
So I think that's a very valid concern. And I think that's part of the reason that our primary means of engaging in the abolitionist project shouldn't be something like just lobbying the state to just abolish the police department or release all the prisoners or abolish any of these systems of social control, right? The goal shouldn't just be getting the state's boot off our neck. It also should be building up alternatives, building the new world in the shell of the old, as the Wobblies put it, right? And one thing that Jason Bias says in his introductory essay to this same volume, this Total Abolition book, his introductory essay called Melting Mountains of Ice, Jason writes about how one reason that we should invest in anarchist projects as well as anarchist research to figure out ways to engage in self-governance and support people who are striving to engage in self-governance and who are building up alternatives to the police within their own communities is that the flip side of building the new world in the shell of the old is this notion of a collapse in which we're left with nothing but the shell, right? And in that case, yeah, we would see the types of problems that people are concerned about, at least for a while, right? There would be a risk of violent gangs coming in and exploiting the situation. And so, of course, people on the ground have incentives to try to devise solutions that aren't that, or to try to devise other ways of governing themselves. But there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, which is why I think it's very important that a big part of our priorities right now be helping people devise and improve and work through the potential errors and pitfalls in experiments in self-governance. And one silver lining of how bad the state is that those who are served quite poorly by the state's legal system have incentives to try to devise alternatives right now, and many of them are doing that. So some of the best work that abolitionists do involves building up alternatives to the state and the prison system and the police. And so one website that documents some of this is called 1 Million Experiments. I have a link to that in the essay, in a footnote. There are other projects by abolitionists that are aimed at this sort of thing. So the Oakland Power Projects, for example, is developing alternatives to emergency services so that people in mental health crises and other types of health crises have people that they can call without the police coming because they called 911. The Audre Lorde Project operates groups like the Safe Neighborhood Campaign and the Safe Outside the System Collective. And this is a group in New York City that's largely led by queer and trans people of color. And so they have very understandable reasons to not want to interact with the NYPD, but they also face real risks of crime, especially hate crimes, and perhaps also things like domestic abuse and sexual violence, right? And so they're devising ways of trying to deal with that. And so I think that there is a real risk that if we find ourselves in a situation of collapse, the empty space left by the state would create a power vacuum that violently motivated groups could fill and exploit. And that's part of why, rather than hoping for collapse or for just the unilateral removal of the state, we should also be actively working on building alternatives and building the new world in the shell of the old.
So in addition to an Austromite style of self-governance, you argue that any value found in services provided by the state could be better met by the market. Economists understand the market process as a means by which we convey and discover knowledge. Left-wing market anarchists understand this process to be an egalitarian means by which individuals can have their subjective wants and needs satisfied. Legal equality amongst market actors is a necessary standard that must be met in order for this to be true. However, one might wager that in order for this process to be truly egalitarian, all participants should also be relatively equal financially. What do you have to say about that?
So I think that's plausible, right? Because we could imagine situations in which some people's knowledge and preferences just don't get incorporated in the market process because they're literally destitute, right? When we talk about markets allocating resources to the most highly valued uses, that's most highly valued by people who have the willingness and ability to pay. And so those who lack the ability to pay, their preferences aren't going to necessarily be taken into account within the market. Now, one thing that might be the case is that in a freed market, there will be access to credit such that people who right now might start off with very little would be able to access loanable funds that would then allow them to engage with and participate in the market process with some expectation that they pay others back. That might be one way of dealing with this. Another way of dealing this might be direct redistribution. The world in which we live has been, of course, scarred by state violence and political capitalism that has redistributed wealth upwards to politically privileged and politically connected cronyists and has hampered the economic opportunities for marginalized people. So one thing that might be worthwhile to engage in is direct redistribution, either voluntary redistribution through mutual aid and or philanthropy or charity, or potentially involuntary rectificatory redistribution, right? A sort of rectification in which you seek reparations for harms done, perhaps by taking wealth from those who have plausibly ill-gotten gains that resulted from colonialism or from government contracts or from something like that, right? So those might be some ways of making the playing field a little bit more level, because while I think that markets in general have egalitarian and leveling properties because anyone who currently is a top dog in the market, anybody who currently has an advantage from being a successful entrepreneur or a successful incumbent business, their success creates incentives for others to mimic their success or for others to introduce competitors or substitutes. People see the profits they're making and say, that might be a profit opportunity for me. If I start producing the same sort of product, but produce it at a lower price, that will create an opportunity for me to possibly undercut this person, get customers who would prefer to pay a lower price than what's offered by that person on the market. And so that competitive, rivalrous market process will result in the rents accrued by incumbent firms being whittled away. And that's a big part of what firms use the state to prevent, right? They use the state to erect barriers to entry that prevent that sort of competitive process from working. That's what intellectual property is about. That's what occupational licensing is about. That's what a large portion of regulatory capture is about. So freed markets would be, in all likelihood, more egalitarian because the entrenched privileges of incumbent firms would not be protected. And the entrenched privileges of, more generally, incumbent wealthy people would not be protected. But there might be good reasons to think that even in addition to the leveling effects of free entry in an open marketplace, it would also be desirable to have other forms of redistribution just to make sure that no one is left out of the market process and that the tendency of markets to direct scarce resources towards more highly valued uses includes those uses valued by those who might otherwise be poor or destitute.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything to be learned from legal systems very different from our own when considering self-governance?
Absolutely. So that question sort of is, in terms of the phrasing, a callback to David Friedman's book, Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And so David Friedman is an anarcho-capitalist economist. By training, he's a physicist, but he does law and economics scholarship. He's a professor in a law school, and he does economic research largely on the diversity of legal systems. And so he's studied a wide range of legal systems, including the legal system of medieval Iceland, which was relatively anarchic. He's studied law. I believe he's in that book. He studies a variety of instances. He might study law among the Roma. I know there are chapters written by David Scarbeck about the governance mechanisms adopted by prison gangs, and by Peter Leeson about the constitutions and governance arrangements used by pirates. And we're not talking contemporary Somali pirates. We're talking like the Pirates of the Caribbean sort of situation, right? And so these pirates had, for instance, relatively egalitarian constitutions that managed their ships as essentially cooperatives, because that was one way of responding to the incentives that they faced based on their particular revenue model. And so studying the diversity of governance institutions is useful for at least two reasons. For one, it's useful because it helps us work through how legal systems and systems of governance work under different conditions, and thinking through the incentives that people face as they're crafting legal systems, as legal systems evolve, and as they're implementing legal systems. So what goes differently from how it's devised on paper to how it's implemented in the world when the rubber hits the road. The other reason it's useful is that I think it's very easy for people to get trapped in status quo bias, to say, well, some people rob other people, some people murder other people, some people assault other people. We need to do something about that. And the thing we do in this society is we have prisons and cops and prosecutors, and we have a court system with jury trials, and that's the way we deal with these problems. And the simple truth is that that type of problem has been present in all societies to some degree or another, and people have devised a really wide range of ways of dealing with it. And if you look at legal systems very different from our own, you can see, oh, well, there are a lot of ways of dealing with it. Some of them might be in some ways worse than our system, and some of them might be in some ways better than our system. And once you see alternatives, that gives you a much broader idea of the space of the sort of choice set that stands before you, right? And that gives you a much broader range of ways to suggest, hey, we could do things differently. We don't have to live this way. We don't have to operate the way we've been operating. So that, I think, is a big advantage of studying the diversity of legal arrangements throughout time and space.
Why is it important to include polycentricity with self-governance?
Polycentricity means a system in which there are multiple formally independent centers of decision-making that will often have overlapping jurisdictions, right? And so it's worth unpacking a little bit more what this means. So some of the first literature on polycentricity was Michael Polanyi's analysis of scientific communities. And so within scientific communities, it's not as though there's one person who is appointed the monopoly researcher on some topic, right? It's not as though within the world of economics, people have said, Nathan Goodman, you are the one who gets to study self-governance, right? That would be terrible. There would be way less research done on self-governance. There would be way less for me to build on. Other people would be stopped from doing value-added research, right? That would be bad. What actually happens is that I do research on self-governance, and a bunch of other people also do research on self-governance, and we might disagree with each other. If someone writes a thing that I read and say, hey, that doesn't seem to be true, I'll write a competing article challenging them on that assertion. The same will be true for my articles. We're both trying to get our articles into good journals. We're potentially going to be referees for each other's articles. And since we've done research on these topics, we can help correct each other's work. We might read drafts of each other's papers in advance and offer criticisms. We might go to seminars where we talk about each other's papers, all these sorts of things. And so the presence of multiple competing researchers and research groups and research teams, multiple disciplines that might research the same questions, but might sometimes come together at conferences or submit articles to some of the same journals, right? This is going to result in contestation among scientists, both within the social sciences and the natural sciences. And that's going to result in a process of evolution and error correction. And it's not going to be perfect, right? You can still wind up with a situation where scientific communities get stuck in a rut, where they wind up going down a wrong path, right? All of that can still happen. But the fact that science is polycentric means that there's opportunities for and incentives for people to correct each other, for people to try out things that other people haven't been trying, for if there's an underexploited potential area of research, somebody to come along and say, hey, what if I looked at it this way, right? That's arguably what Elinor Ostrom did with research on the commons, right? Is that for a long time, research on the commons had been largely theoretical and had just sort of assumed, well, these common pool resource problems are either going to result in catastrophe or they're going to be regulated from the top down or it's going to involve privatization. And she was like, wait a minute, sure seems like there's this whole other space of solutions to these types of problems that people have been trying. And she wrote a bunch about it, and she worked with other researchers who wrote about it. And now there's this whole thriving research community associated with the International Association for the Study of the Commons, and they have their own academic journal, and Ostrom won the Nobel Prize. And so as somebody who was at first operating from a dissenting perspective relative to the mainstream of the literature, she was able to essentially engage in something of a revolution that just changed the way social scientists saw this type of problem situation. So that's one type of polycentricity, is within scientific communities. Within markets tend to work better when they're polycentric, right? I was talking earlier about barriers to entry. So the idea there is, you could imagine a situation, and there are some situations, where one firm controls distribution and production of a particular good or service within an area, right? Maybe there's one hospital in a community, or there's one internet service provider, or there's only a certain number of licenses given people to operate a thing, or someone has a patent and they're the only one who can produce a particular drug, right? Whereas when there's a competitive market process and there's freedom of entry, lots of different people can form competing centers of decision-making that can try to produce these goods and services. The same can happen with governance, right? And that can happen with governance within more of a state or governmental context, or within a self-governing voluntary anarchic context. And so the way in which the Ostroms first studied this was with regards to metropolitan areas. And so people would look at maps of metropolitan areas and they'd say, the school districts are covering different parts, and there are a bunch of them, and they're covering in different parts. They don't map neatly onto the, say, water treatment districts or the police precincts. What the heck is going on with this? This is a crazy quilt. It looks insane. There's all this duplication. So it looks like probably there's too much government. There's too many governments, yet not enough consistency, not enough government provided. This is probably a very bad thing. And so there were moves to consolidate metropolitan governments under sort of one umbrella in order to reduce duplication and make the system more efficient, right? Put it all under one sort of easy to track, legible bureaucratic hierarchy. This was sometimes called the Unigov movement. And the Ostroms looked at this, and the sort of seminal article on this, where a lot of the polycentricity literature starts, is by not Elinor Ostrom, but her husband Vincent Ostrom, as well as Charles Thibault and a guy named Warren. And Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren looked at these metropolitan governance arrangements and they said, okay, these are polycentric, and they might work as polycentric systems in a similar way to scientific communities or competitive markets. Citizens have the ability to vote with their feet, to more easily move between different service providers, right? If you don't have to move across the country to get to a better school district, but instead need to move across town, that might create better incentives and better ability to get to a school district that meets your needs or your child's needs. If these are smaller, there might be more of an ability for people's voice to make an impact, and so on. And so then they did a variety of empirical studies. I sort of mentioned this earlier with the police studies, but studying not just police, but other public services, and generally finding that these smaller and more polycentric arrangements tended to function better for serving various citizen desires. And this doesn't always mean providing everything on the smallest scale possible, right? You might have a bunch of different police precincts, but they might contract with one crime lab because there might be economies of scale in the production of forensic science, say. And that can have its own problems. Roger Koppel's written a bunch of very good stuff on the perverse incentives associated with forensic science because of their ties to police and prosecutors, and this generating a pro-prosecution bias in the distribution of the errors in their forensic science research. So there are big problems with forensic science, but that can be one example where you have a polycentric system that still has some things that are produced on a larger scale and some things produced on a smaller scale. And so federalist systems of government where you have multiple levels of government, like a federal government, states, cities, counties, precincts within cities, and so on, these can be polycentric systems. But it's still the case that you can't necessarily, once you're within one of these jurisdictions, that jurisdiction has a monopoly. You can't exit without moving across territory, and you can't introduce your own alternative governance provider. So if instead we can introduce both non-territorial exit, the ability to change who your governance provider is without moving, and the ability to introduce a new provider of governance services to try out a new form of association to solve the types of problems that we want governance to solve, then we introduce whole new layers of polycentricity. And so an anarchist approach to self-governance is likely going to be very polycentric in the sense that there's freedom of entry, in the sense that there's freedom of exit, in the sense that we will often have small voluntarily associated clubs or groups that will allow people to have direct input and voice and participation in collective decision-making. And this is going to result in an evolving patchwork of different governance arrangements that are voluntarily associated. And that might look from the outside like an illegible crazy quilt, but it will tend to have evolutionary properties that will tend towards satisfying the participants' preferences. Doesn't mean it'll work perfectly, but it does mean that it will have a greater degree of adaptiveness and responsiveness than a monocentric system would.
In the article, you admit that self-governance might not always work. If this is the case, why not just seek reform instead of outright abolition?
So that's a very good question. And it's one that's very much in line with sort of the economist's case that regarding marginalism that we discussed early on, right? So the idea that, well, why not make changes on the margin? Because it might be the case that having less police power and less police presence in communities and less prisons and a smaller military budget is all very useful. But bringing all those things down to zero and replacing it all with self-governance might be too extreme and might ignore the failure modes of self-governance. And so maybe we should make a variety of reforms in a libertarian or progressive or liberal or humane direction, rather than engaging in abolition. And part of the response I'd have to that would be to point back to the knowledge problem and the power problem. So engaging in attempts at political reform is going to result in our efforts being filtered through political processes that are going to be riddled with various perverse incentives. And once the reforms are passed, they're going to need to be implemented by people who are operating within the system and have the incentives that the system creates, that the system generates. So, for example, suppose one of our concerns is, as mine is, the treatment and mistreatment of trans people within prisons. Well, one thing that you might do to deal with that is to say, well, we're going to have gender responsive prisons. We're going to open up separate wings of prisons that are for trans or gender nonconforming people. That way we don't need to either put trans women in women's prisons where maybe, especially if the trans women are pre-op, they're going to have conflict with the cis women in the prison and potentially make the cis women feel unsafe. And we're not going to have to put them in men's prisons where they're really vulnerable to sexual assault and rape and brutal transphobic bigotry and violence, right? Maybe to avoid those two seemingly bad options, we'll create gender responsive prisons, new wings to prisons for transgender and gender nonconforming people. All right, so what you've done is you've then created a facility for state control whose operators have an incentive to keep it running. And the way you keep it running is by locking more trans and gender nonconforming people in prison. So you've expanded both the coercive capacity of the state and the incentive for state actors to incarcerate a particular type of people. A similar type of issue happened in the mid to late 19th century when people were concerned about mistreatment of women in majority male populated prisons. And so they started establishing women's prisons. And after that, the number of women sentenced to prison started to heavily rise because prior to that, judges would often be like, well, I'm not going to send this woman to prison. That's going to be really horrible for her. But now judges were like, oh, well, there's prisons that are for women like her. This is suitable. And so they would be more willing on the margin to send women to prison. And so one thing we need to be careful about with reforms is to think through the unintended consequences of reforms and how they can expand the coercive capacity of the state and the incentives for political actors to engage in forms of coercion and social control that we might strongly dislike and be strongly opposed to as abolitionists. This doesn't mean never attempt a reform, right? I think reducing the scope of police ability to engage in civil asset forfeiture, for example, would have very good consequences. I think abolishing qualified immunity would have very good consequences. I think expanding the number of immigrants who are let into the country would have very good consequences. Abolishing various immigration restrictions, even if we don't abolish the Border Patrol and ICE, would tend to have very good consequences. And so there are reforms that would be value added. But the difficulty is that we need to think through how the reforms would be implemented by state actors who are not all committed libertarians or abolitionists or kind-hearted progressives, but instead are selected through the political process. And we also need to think through the expected probability of our preferred reforms passing and how they're likely to get watered down through the political process. So what are they likely to get bundled with in bills, for example? And it might sometimes be more cost effective to devise ways to route around the state or to reduce the ability of the state to successfully enforce their laws and impose their order on people, rather than trying to get a reform out of the state that current political actors have strong incentives not to implement. So reform shouldn't be off the table, but we should be cautious about it, is my general view on it.
You mentioned a few grassroots organizations doing good work when it comes to abolition. What are some non-electoral tactics that you find the most and the least promising?
So that's a very good question. And I would say that in terms of what I find most promising, I like to think of non-electoral tactics in terms of what types of functions they serve. And so one set of functions for non-electoral tactics is providing alternatives to existing services or providing direct services to people. And so here, things like mutual aid projects and projects where people are building up alternatives to prisons, these seem like viable types of projects for building up alternatives to the state and showing people that another world is possible. So that's very promising in its own right. The second sort of class of non-electoral tactics that I tend to see as very promising involves reducing the ability of the state to directly harm people and helping people evade or fight the state. So these would include things like investing in encryption projects, educating people about jury nullification, helping people film cops, engaging in cop watching, warning people about police and police patrols, engaging in anti-deportation campaigns or deportation defense campaigns to help protect people from being deported. And so these types of projects, the goal is to help people not get crushed by the state. And so we have alternatives to the state, avoiding getting crushed by the state. And then we also have a set of tactics that are related to maybe harm reduction from the harms that the state has done. And so these are similar to the sort of earlier mutual aid projects, but they're directly responding to harms that the state does. So these are things like no more deaths going into the desert and distributing various forms of humanitarian aid. So putting water out, for example, so that migrants don't die as they're crossing dangerous routes that various fortifications along the U.S. border have forced migrants onto. So there was a policy adopted starting in the 1990s called prevention through deterrence, where the idea was we will fortify the easiest and safest areas of the border to cross. This will deter migrants because it will become costlier and more difficult to cross the border. The difficulty, of course, is that while that deterred some people because the risk of death became substantially higher, those who continued to try to cross the border faced even more dangerous conditions. Deaths in the desert increased. And of course, it didn't necessarily have a deterrent effect on a large number of migrants because for many migrants, the potential gain from coming to America is so enormous, right? In terms of both escaping poverty and having better economic opportunity, and in many cases, escaping humanitarian crises and forms of abuse and state violence. So these are, I think, the most promising general categories of tactics. Building alternatives to the state, getting the state off people's backs and protecting them from state violence, and engaging in harm reduction for victims of state violence. It's harder to think about what I find least promising, I suppose. I guess what I tend to be relatively pessimistic about, that some people are relatively optimistic about in anarchist circles, is stuff involving direct forms of destruction and rioting, as well as direct violent resistance. So I'm not all that optimistic about these modes of tactics for a few reasons. One, I'm very worried about backlash. So I think that some people who are at least initially sympathetic to moves in a more liberatory direction may, when they see images of what they perceive as chaos or destruction in a community, right, they might say, oh, wow, it turns out we actually really do need the cops. This is out of control, right? And so you can, whereas building an alternative to the state and building an alternative to the police and showing people, hey, we can govern ourselves, we can address these types of problems that you think we need the police for, that shows people, oh, there's a path besides the police. There's an alternative path. Whereas if people turn on their televisions and there's a bunch of news stories about cities on fire, that winds up getting a lot of them to think, oh, wow, we really need to crack down, right? And that doesn't mean that these can't be useful tactics in specific circumstances, right? Like some things that get reported on as riots might be legitimate self-defense against the police, or might be other modes of resistance that serve a useful function on the ground for the people doing it, right? So I don't want to preclude that entirely, but I do think there's bigger risks of backlash with these types of tactics compared to a lot of other tactics. So that's one type of non-electoral tactic where I'm worried about the problems. Direct attempts at violent revolution, I worry about it plunging societies into a situation of civil war or resulting in people seizing power and creating a state. So I tend to be relatively pessimistic about outright violent revolution. And that's also in part informed by Erica Chenoweth's research that tends to find that social movements that use primarily nonviolent tactics tend to, within her data set, be more successful than movements that engage more in militant tactics, in part because nonviolent tactics allow you to bring in a broader range of people who can successfully and safely contribute to those types of projects. It's not risk-free by any means, but more types of people are able to participate in those movements than movements where the primary skill set you need is a military skill set. So violent revolution is another type of non-electoral tactic that I am relatively pessimistic about.
All right, so we have one listener question, and then we'll move to the actual end of our conversation here.
Sure.
The listener question is, some critics of police brutality and the prison industrial complex ignore the legacy of white supremacy and insist on a colorblind approach to the issue. What's wrong with the instinct to ignore racism when advocating for abolition?
So I think that one big problem with ignoring who has been affected by a particular form of state violence, repression, or social control is that it puts part of our analysis off the table. It prevents us from seeing the full scope of the problem. And so if we ignore the role that white supremacy has played in the structure of policing, incarceration, borders, and empire in the US and in other Western countries and in colonial contexts, then that means that we're not going to keep important things in context. And by not keeping important things in context, we're going to miss both how the system evolved and therefore ways in which we can try to dissolve it. We're also going to miss features of who has been most affected and therefore who has local knowledge about what might be suitable ways to fight back or to build alternatives. And so if we just see the policing and prison systems as just violations of abstract rules, and they are violations of abstract rules that I think we ought to keep in mind. So the general presumption against locking a human being in a cage, that applies regardless of race. So that is a presumption that we should promulgate as a moral rule and as a general moral rule regardless of race. That's something I believe. But ignoring the way in which the actual implementation of the prison industrial complex has involved racism might mean that we'll both miss some of the harms and miss out on opportunities to work with and act in solidarity with those who have been most harmed by the system and may have for years now been thinking creatively about ways to build up alternatives to it. So empirically, within the United States, the prison abolition movement is largely led by people of color, in part because people of color are the ones who have borne a large part of the brunt of state violence and therefore have strong incentives to seek out ways to provide alternative ways of managing conflict within their communities. And so we should be attentive to that and act in solidarity with people who are experiencing that. This doesn't mean we should treat the problems solely as racial problems. I do sometimes worry about situations in which people see the problem as only a problem of white supremacy and might therefore allow themselves to fall into the punitive mindset. I've seen people on Twitter, for example, look at and share videos of white women getting beaten by cops and say, haha, look at that Karen or something, right? And that seems to me to be very wrong, because the problem is police beating people. That's a big part. That's a problem regardless of who the victim of it is. That's a wrongful exercise of domination and social control and state violence, regardless of the race of the victim. But understanding the racialized elements of this system of social control can help us understand how it's worked and who might be building up resistance movements that we can plug into and provide support for, rather than just reinventing the wheel and ignoring good work that's been done. So that, I think, is important, in part because our society is currently quite segregated, right? Not in a formal legal way, but the legacy of residential segregation and professional segregation and segregation of social networks is a real thing. So if I were to, as a, upper middle class economist, look only within my direct social networks for insight on abolition, then I would be looking largely at fellow relatively well-off academics. And there can be valuable insights there, but I'm going to be missing a lot of the people who are doing on-the-ground work to resist state violence and harm that's done directly against their communities. And if I miss out on that, then I miss out on where a huge amount of the real action in the abolitionist movement is happening, and where the creative energy by people who have incentives to act creatively to resist the prison industrial complex, they're going to discover insights that somebody who's just engaging in analytical work without having skin in the game is not going to discover. And so that, I think, is really important for abolitionists to be aware of, both so that we get the best insights and so that we can act in solidarity with those who are most directly affected and who are fighting back.
Other than C4SS, where should folks go to learn more about everything that we've discussed today?
For learning about legal systems very different from ours, you could probably go to David Friedman's website, because a lot of his books are on his website. So he has a web version of legal systems very different from ours. For learning about my work, you could go to nathanpgoodman.com, and that has links to other podcasts I've been on. It has a list of my research papers, and it has links to my Social Science Research Network profile, where various working papers of mine are uploaded, and links to my Google Scholar profile, where you can find a lot of my academic work. And so, in addition to going to the Center for a Stateless Society page, you can find my work at nathanpgoodman.com. You can find work by various prison abolitionists at the website of the abolitionist group Critical Resistance. So that's criticalresistance.org. I'm not affiliated with them, but they do a lot of good abolitionist work. So those are just a few of the places where you can find work relevant to today's conversation.
All right. And did you want to give a shout out to your Twitter handle or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at Nathan P. Goodman.
Nathan Goodman, thank you so much. It's always an honor to chat with you. And I think people are going to find not only your article, but your thoughts on it here very valuable. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy talking with you.
All right, Nathan Goodman, thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.